He barked at a chair no one had touched, and every Marine in that chapel knew the dog was not barking at grief. Rain moved softly against the stained glass windows of St. Matthew's Chapel in Norfolk, Virginia, turning the morning light into long blue ribbons across the wooden floor. Outside, the flag in the courtyard hung heavy and wet, snapping only when the wind found enough strength to lift it. Inside, nobody moved much. Men in dress blues stood shoulder to shoulder along the aisle, white gloves still, faces carved into the kind of silence learned only after too many goodbyes. At the front of the chapel rested a closed casket draped in the American flag, its red and white stripes bright against the dark polished wood, its blue field folded toward the place where Corporal Daniel Mercer's mother sat with both hands wrapped around a handkerchief. The air smelled of lilies, rainwater, old hymnals, and the faint waxy smoke of candles burning near the altar. It was supposed to be a funeral. It was supposed to be dignified, quiet, complete. But in the first row, beside the casket, there was an empty chair. No one had explained it aloud. No one needed to. It had been placed there for Daniel's father, a man who had died years earlier and whose absence had followed the family like a second shadow. The chair was simple, dark oak, with a cream cushion and a small folded program resting on the seat. Daniel Mercer's name was printed across the front in black letters. Beloved son, faithful Marine, gone too soon. For nearly 20 minutes, the chapel held itself together. The chaplain read softly. The rain answered in whispers. Daniel's mother, Emily, stared ahead as though blinking might break her apart. Then Ghost stood up. He had been lying near the aisle at Staff Sergeant Isaiah Brooks's left boot, a white German Shepherd K9, with pale fur brushed clean for the ceremony, and eyes the color of old amber held up to sunlight. His harness had been polished. A small black ribbon had been tied near his collar. He looked less like a dog and more like a prayer someone had forgotten how to speak. Until that moment, he had not made a sound. Not when the casket was carried in. Not when Emily touched the flag with trembling fingers. Not when the first hymn rose thin and fragile into the rafters. But now his ears lifted. His head turned. His body became still in a way that made Isaiah look down before anyone else noticed. Isaiah Brooks knew that stillness. He had seen it outside schoolhouses overseas, beside supply trucks, in narrow streets where dust hung so thick a man could taste metal on his tongue. Ghost never wasted movement. Ghost never performed grief for a room. The dog stared at the empty chair. 1 second passed, then another. A Marine near the wall shifted his weight, the leather of his shoe giving a small complaint against the floor. Ghost's lips tightened, not in anger, not in fear, but in warning. A low sound gathered in his chest. Isaiah reached for the harness strap, slow and careful. Easy, boy, he whispered, barely louder than breath. Ghost did not look at him. The chaplain's voice faltered, then continued. Emily lifted her eyes. The chapel seemed to lean toward the dog. Ghost took 1 step forward. His claws tapped the floor. Then he barked. It was not loud enough to be wild, but it cut through the chapel like a bell struck in fog. One bark. Sharp. Certain. A few people flinched. The chaplain stopped reading. Isaiah tightened his grip. Ghost. He murmured, the name heavy in his throat. The dog barked again, directly at the chair. Not at the casket. Not at the door. Not at any living person anyone could see. At the empty chair. A woman in the second row covered her mouth. Someone whispered that the poor dog was confused. Someone else said animals knew things. Isaiah said nothing. His eyes moved from Ghost's rigid shoulders to the cushion of the chair, to the folded program, to the floor beneath it where a small crescent of dried red mud marked the wood near one leg. His breathing changed. Not enough for most people to notice. Enough for Ghost. The dog stepped closer, nose low, then froze again as if the air around that chair carried a voice no human ear could reach. Isaiah felt the chapel disappear at the edges. The lilies, the candles, the uniforms, the hymnals, all of it blurred into the old familiar pressure of a moment before truth broke through. He had come to bury Daniel Mercer. He had come to stand tall for a mother who had already lost too much. He had come believing the file, the report, the folded flag, the clean, terrible sentence that said a young Marine was gone. But Ghost was telling him something else. Ghost was telling him the chair was not empty. And in that quiet chapel, with rain sliding down the glass and every heart holding its breath, Isaiah Brooks understood the first impossible thing about that morning. His dog was not mourning the dead. His dog had found the living. Isaiah Brooks let out a slow breath, the kind that feels like it carries all the weight of a morning spent in half-light and quiet expectation. He did not move toward the aisle, did not call Ghost back, but his eyes never left the dog as Ghost stood firm, nose quivering, ears upright, every muscle attuned to something invisible. The chapel felt smaller somehow, the high ceilings and polished wood pressing down with a weight that belonged not to the building, but to the unspoken tension in the air. Emily Mercer clutched the handkerchief tighter, her knuckles white, eyes glimmering with unshed tears, yet she did not speak, knowing that any sound might break the fragile spell that held the room. Isaiah glanced around and saw other Marines shifting subtly, unsure how to act, their polished shoes squeaking faintly on the floor. The hymn continued, but the music no longer mattered. It was the subtle language of Ghost that captured the moment. Each step he took toward the chair measured, deliberate, a rhythm Isaiah had known in war zones where silence spoke louder than orders. Isaiah knelt slightly, the fabric of his dress blues creasing softly, and whispered to Ghost in a low voice that only the dog could hear. "What is it, boy?" Ghost did not look at him, did not respond to the question, yet Isaiah felt the communication, the recognition, the urgency. A memory stirred from the depths, the memory of a day long ago when Ghost had guided them through a maze of narrow streets, each alley carrying a different threat, and how he had trusted Ghost with his life without question. The dog had never faltered, never hesitated, and now, in this quiet sanctuary far from the desert sands and dust of military bases, the same resolve emanated from him. Isaiah arose slowly, his hand hovering near the harness, yet unwilling to touch it, unwilling to interrupt the flow of instincts that had carried the dog through countless missions. Outside, the rain continued to tap softly against the chapel windows, a steady drum that marked time without haste. The stained glass colors flickered as the wind shifted, painting the marble floors in hues of amber, deep blue, and soft red, each color reflecting off the varnished pews, and the effect was almost ethereal, as if the chapel itself paused to watch. Ghost took another step, a precise placement of paw on wood that made the floorboards groan slightly, a subtle sound that drew Isaiah's attention to the faint trail of dust and moisture leading to the chair. He followed the line with his eyes, noting how it ended at the small crease in the cushion, where the program lay folded, the name of Daniel Mercer crisp against the paper, unmarked by time. Isaiah's mind shifted, as minds do when the impossible seems present. He remembered the day they had deployed together, how Daniel had run ahead in formation to check a classroom, how Ghost had stayed beside him, always aware, always protective. The image collided with the present, and Isaiah realized that the empty chair was not just an absence. It was a placeholder, a signal, a message that had traveled far, through months and through the absence of a man who might not have returned. Ghost barked again, a short, controlled sound, not in panic but in insistence, and Isaiah felt his chest tighten. He moved forward slowly, careful to make no sudden gesture, letting Ghost lead the way in the subtle choreography of recognition. The dog stopped once more, head tilting slightly. Amber eyes focused on the floor just in front of the chair, and Isaiah saw a small piece of cloth, folded and pressed under the edge, almost invisible but for the faint color of blue that caught the light. He bent slightly, lifting the cloth with the tip of his finger, and the texture was unmistakable, the cotton of Daniel's uniform, faintly worn, carrying the scent of home, of the desert, of shared hours and whispered words. Isaiah straightened, the rain-soaked morning fading from awareness, replaced by a clarity brought on by memory, presence, and instinct. Ghost remained in front of the chair, tail low but firm, body rigid, every nerve aligned with the truth that Isaiah now understood. This was not mere mourning. This was discovery, the first thread of a story that had been waiting for them to notice, waiting for the faithful to recognize the unseen. The chapel seemed to exhale collectively, a quiet moment where the world outside and inside blurred, and Isaiah, standing behind Ghost, allowed himself to feel the old weight of responsibility, the acute awareness that some things, some truths, are carried not by words, but by the silent insistence of those who will not let you forget. Ghost lowered his head slightly, nostrils flaring, and for the briefest instant, the dog's amber eyes met Isaiah's. And in that gaze, the Marine understood that they were on the verge of something extraordinary, something that had waited in shadows and silence, in absence and patience, a reunion not yet complete, but whispered in the language of trust and devotion that only Ghost could speak. Every breath in the chapel held that anticipation, every heartbeat synchronized to the subtle taps of paws and the quiet dripping of rain from the eaves. Isaiah stepped closer, the polished wood of the floor warming faintly under his shoes, the scent of lilies mingling with the faint, familiar aroma of Ghost's coat, and he felt the full weight of expectation settle over him. A soft pressure, a reminder that this morning, like all mornings that matter, was not about ceremony, not about tradition, but about the unbroken thread of loyalty. The invisible bond between a Marine and his dog stretched across months, across miles, across absence, and now, finally, coming into focus. Isaiah held the small blue cloth between his fingers as if it were something sacred, and for a moment the chapel was so quiet he could hear the rainwater sliding from the roof into the gutters outside. The piece was no bigger than 2 inches wide, frayed along one edge, darkened with old dust, but the color pulled a memory from him so clearly that his throat tightened before he could speak. It was navy blue cotton, the same kind Daniel Mercer used to tie around his wrist during long field days, because he said it reminded him of home, of the Little League bracelet his father once gave him, of summers in Virginia when the grass smelled sweet after thunderstorms and nothing in the world had yet asked him to be brave. Isaiah turned the cloth slightly in the colored light from the stained glass window. It should not have been there. According to the report, Daniel's personal items had been recovered, cataloged, sealed, and returned. According to the report, the cloth had been found with the damaged dog tag. According to the report, everything had ended overseas, 18 months earlier, beneath a sky full of dust and sirens and frightened voices calling for help. But reports were written by people. Ghost was made of memory. The white K9 leaned forward and pressed his nose close to Isaiah's hand, drawing in the scent with slow, trembling breaths. Then his ears flattened, not from fear, but from recognition so deep it seemed to pass through his whole body. Isaiah felt it before he understood it. Ghost was not searching for Daniel in the past. He was tracking him in the present. Emily Mercer rose from the front pew with unsteady hands, the handkerchief still clutched between her fingers. Her black dress moved softly as she stepped closer, every eye in the chapel following her, but no one stopping her. She looked first at Ghost, then at Isaiah, then at the tiny strip of cloth in his palm. Her voice came out thin. That was Danny's. Isaiah swallowed. He wanted to say he knew. He wanted to say he was sorry. He wanted to say something strong enough to hold the room together. But all he could manage was a quiet, "Yes, ma'am." Emily reached toward it, then stopped before touching it, as if the space between her hand and the cloth held a truth too fragile to disturb. Ghost gave a low whine, the kind Isaiah had heard only once before, months after the deployment, when the dog had slept beside Daniel's old duffel bag and dreamed with his paws moving against the floor. Isaiah looked down again, this time past the cloth, past the cushion, past the folded funeral program. On the wood under the chair was the crescent of red mud he had noticed earlier. It was dry and cracked, pressed into the floor grain by the weight of a shoe or a boot. Norfolk had seen rain for 3 straight days. The mud outside the chapel was dark brown, almost black near the garden beds. This red dust did not belong here. Isaiah crouched, ignoring the tight pull of his dress uniform across his shoulders. He rubbed a small bit between his gloved fingers. Fine, powdery, stubborn. It carried a faint mineral smell beneath the lilies and candle wax, a smell that did not belong in a Virginia chapel. Sunbaked earth, old stone, dry roads. His mind moved backward before he could stop it, across an ocean, across heat shimmering over low buildings, across the sound of children laughing in a courtyard that had once been a school. Daniel had knelt there with Ghost beside him, tying blue strips of cloth around the wrists of children who had already been checked and counted for evacuation, making a game of it so they would not be afraid. "Blue means you are on my team," Daniel had told them, smiling like a man who still believed gentleness could outlast the noise of the world. Ghost had sat beside him, patient and proud, letting the children touch his white fur with careful fingers. Isaiah had watched from 10 yards away, one hand raised to shield his eyes from the glare, thinking Daniel was too young to carry so much kindness and still call it duty. Now that same color lay in Isaiah's palm, brought somehow to this chair, to this morning, to the place where Daniel was supposed to be mourned instead of found. The chaplain stepped down from the altar, his Bible held gently against his chest. "Sergeant Brooks," he said softly, "should we pause the service?" Isaiah did not answer right away. Ghost had turned toward the side aisle now, nose lifted, body angled toward the rear doors of the chapel. Not the main entrance, not the casket, not the flowers. The rear doors. Isaiah felt his pulse slow into something. Focused and old, the rhythm of training waking beneath grief. He slid the blue cloth carefully into his breast pocket, close to his heart. Then he looked at Emily, whose face had gone pale with something more dangerous than sorrow. "Hope." "Mrs. Mercer," he said, his voice low and steady. "I need you to stay here for just a minute." She shook her head once, small but firm. "If this is about my son, I am going with you." Isaiah looked at her, at the mother who had already survived the longest walk a parent can make, and he did not have the cruelty to deny her. Ghost gave one sharp breath, almost a command. Then he moved toward the rear of the chapel, slow at first, then quicker, following a trail no human eye could see. The Marines parted without being told. The floor creaked beneath Isaiah's steps. Emily followed behind him, one hand on the pews to steady herself. And as the rear door opened to the wet gray morning, a gust of cold air swept into the chapel, carrying with it the smell of rain, pavement, and something else, faint but unmistakable to the dog who had waited 18 months to find it again. The rear steps of St. Matthew's Chapel were slick with rain, and Isaiah Brooks moved down them with the careful balance of a man who had learned long ago that haste could make truth harder to reach. Ghost was already at the bottom, white fur darkened in patches by the wet air, nose low to the stone walkway, shoulders working beneath his polished harness. The chapel door eased shut behind them, soft as a held breath. Emily Mercer stood close beside Isaiah, one hand pressed against the railing, her face turned toward the narrow service lane that ran behind the church. Beyond it, the cemetery stretched under a gray Virginia sky, rows of headstones shining with water, small flags trembling in the grass. The air smelled of wet brick, cut flowers, motor oil from the parking lot, and that faint impossible trace Ghost had caught through the storm. Isaiah looked down at the dog and felt the morning bend backward in time. There had been another gray morning, 18 months earlier, though the sky then was full of dust instead of rain. They had been stationed near a small town where the roads were narrow, the buildings low, and the wind carried the scent of bread ovens, diesel fuel, and dry earth. Isaiah had been 36 then, a staff sergeant with a steady voice and a heart that had already learned to keep its soft places hidden. Daniel Mercer had been 27, still young enough to grin when the sun came up, still gentle enough to kneel in the dirt so a frightened child would not have to look up at him. Ghost had walked between them like a living promise, his white coat nearly glowing against the tan world, his ears catching every distant door, every shifting footstep, every whisper the men could not hear. Their mission that week had not been about glory. It had been about moving families from a damaged neighborhood to a safer medical station 6 miles away, one bus at a time, one name at a time, one trembling hand at a time. Daniel was the one who made people trust them. He carried bottled water in his cargo pockets. He kept butterscotch candies in a pouch because his grandmother had told him sweetness calmed fear faster than speeches. He learned the names of children even when he could not pronounce them perfectly, and when they laughed at his mistakes, he laughed too. Isaiah used to watch him and think that some men were born with a lamp inside them, something quiet and stubborn that kept burning even when the world tried to blow it out. Ghost loved Daniel in the simple, serious way a dog chooses his person. Not loudly, not foolishly, completely. At night, when the team rested inside the temporary command room, Daniel would sit on an overturned supply crate and rub the spot between Ghost's ears while Isaiah checked route maps beneath a dim yellow bulb. Sometimes Daniel spoke to the dog as if Ghost understood every word. Maybe he did. You keep him honest, all right. Daniel would say, nodding toward Isaiah. He gets too serious. Isaiah would not look up, but the corner of his mouth would move. I'm standing right here, Mercer. Daniel would answer. That is why I said it quiet, Staff Sergeant. Then Ghost would give one soft huff, and for a few seconds the room would feel almost like home. That was the thing Isaiah remembered most now, standing in the rain behind the chapel while Ghost worked the trail. Not the reports, not the official language, the small hours, the way Daniel tied a navy blue cloth around his wrist every morning before first light, the way he tapped 2 fingers against Ghost's collar before every patrol, a little ritual no one had taught him, the way Ghost always leaned closer after that touch, as though accepting a charge no paper could record. One afternoon, outside the old schoolhouse, Daniel had taken that same roll of blue cloth and cut it into strips with a pair of dull scissors. Children stood in a line near the courtyard wall, nervous and silent, each waiting to be checked and placed with a family group. Daniel knelt in front of the first boy and tied a strip around his small wrist. Blue team, he said, pressing a hand to his own chest, then pointing to the child with a smile. The boy did not understand the words, but he understood the kindness. Soon every child wanted one. Ghost sat beside Daniel like a guard made of snow and patience while small hands touched his fur. Isaiah had stood nearby, scanning the street, pretending not to feel the ache in his chest. Daniel looked over at him once and held up a strip of cloth. Want one, Staff Sergeant? Isaiah shook his head. I have enough decoration. Daniel tied it around his own wrist instead. Suit yourself. Blue team is very exclusive. Later, when the families had been loaded safely and the sun was lowering behind the broken roofline, Isaiah found Ghost lying with his head on Daniel's boot, both of them exhausted, both of them peaceful in a place that rarely offered peace. He remembered thinking that if loyalty had a shape, it might look exactly like that. A young Marine with dust on his sleeves, a white K9 breathing beside him, the last warm light of evening holding them both as if God had paused the world for one merciful second. Now Ghost stopped at the edge of the chapel's service lane. His head lifted. His body went rigid. Isaiah came back to the present all at once. Rain slid down his face, cold against his skin. Emily whispered Daniel's name behind him, not as a question, but as a prayer. Across the lane, near the far end of the parking lot, a faint red smear of dried earth marked the wet pavement beneath the tires of a plain white medical van. The white medical van sat beyond the last row of cars like something that had arrived by mistake and decided to remain unnoticed. Its paint was dull beneath the rain, its rear windows tinted gray, its tires marked with the same red dust that did not belong on any road within miles of Norfolk. Isaiah Brooks stood still for half a second, not because he was afraid, but because the past had stepped so close to the present that moving too quickly felt almost disrespectful. Ghost did not wait. The white K9 crossed the service lane with his head low and his body sure, each paw landing in shallow puddles that broke the reflection of the chapel behind him. Isaiah followed, one hand slightly raised to keep Emily close but safe, the other hovering near Ghost's harness without touching it. He could feel the chapel watching from behind the windows. Marines in dress blues had gathered near the rear doors now, faces pale in the rain-colored light, unsure whether they were witnessing a mistake, a miracle, or the beginning of both. Ghost reached the van and stopped at the passenger side, pressing his nose to the seam of the door. He inhaled once, then twice, then gave a sound Isaiah had not heard since the last night before Daniel vanished. It was not a bark. It was lower than a whine and softer than a growl, a broken little breath that seemed to come from somewhere old inside him. Emily brought both hands to her mouth. Isaiah stepped closer to the window, but the tint only gave back a blurred reflection of his own face, dark skin wet with rain, jaw tight, eyes carrying more hope than he trusted. Hello, he called, voice calm, professional, but edged with something personal. No answer came. Only the rain on metal. Only Ghost's breathing. Isaiah moved around the front of the van, reading the small magnetic sign on the driver's door. Tidewater Patient Transport. The lettering was clean, the logo plain, but one corner of the sign had peeled up slightly, revealing unmarked white paint beneath. That detail made Isaiah's instincts tighten. Not danger. Not yet. But wrongness. A thing pretending to be ordinary. He looked through the windshield. A folded paper lay on the dashboard, blurred by beads of rain. A paper cup sat in the holder. The keys were not in the ignition. No driver in sight. Ghost pawed once at the side door, then looked back at Isaiah with fierce, silent insistence. Isaiah reached for the handle. Locked. He knocked. 3 firm taps. This is Staff Sergeant Isaiah Brooks, United States Marine Corps. Is anyone inside? The words floated in the wet air and faded. From somewhere inside the van came a sound so faint that Emily might have imagined it if Ghost had not reacted first. The dog rose onto his hind legs, front paws against the door, harness creaking. His ears went forward. His whole body trembled. Isaiah heard it then. A breath. Human. Weak, uneven, close. Ma'am, step back, Isaiah said softly. Emily did not argue, though her eyes never left the van. A younger Marine had followed them across the lot and now approached from behind, rain shining on the brim of his cover. Staff Sergeant. Isaiah glanced at him. Find a chaplain. Call emergency services. Tell them we may have a patient locked inside a transport vehicle. The Marine turned immediately and ran. Isaiah faced the van again. He would not break the window unless he had to. He had seen panic make people rough when gentleness was needed. So he crouched beside Ghost, placed a hand on the dog's wet shoulder, and spoke low. Show me. Ghost dropped down, circled toward the rear of the van, and stopped at the back doors. There, caught near the bumper, was a strip of fabric. Navy blue, worn thin. Isaiah's heart gave one hard beat. He pulled it free. This piece was longer than the one from the chapel, knotted at one end, and there was a faint crease across it where it had been tied, untied, and tied again by hands that remembered a ritual even if the mind had forgotten everything else. Emily saw it and whispered, Daniel used to do that. Isaiah looked at her. The rain had flattened a strand of gray hair against her cheek. Her face was no longer only grieving. It was frightened of hope, and Isaiah knew that fear. Hope could be cruel when it arrived too early. He turned back to the van and cupped his hands around the small rear window. Through the tint, through the rain, through the dim interior, he saw the outline of a person lying across a narrow bench seat under a gray blanket. Thin shoulders, one hand visible near the edge of the blanket. The hand was pale, scarred with old weathering, fingers curled around something dark. Ghost saw it too. He pressed his nose to the door and released one soft bark, almost gentle, as if calling someone from sleep. Inside the van, the fingers moved. Barely, but they moved. Emily made a sound that was half sob, half prayer. Isaiah's voice dropped into a steadiness he had earned the hard way. Sir, can you hear me? Help is coming. The figure inside shifted slightly, and the object in his hand rolled against the glass of the rear door. It was a piece of black leather with a small silver tag. Not a weapon, not a tool. AK-9 collar strap. Isaiah stared at it, and suddenly he was no longer in a parking lot behind a chapel in Virginia. He was back in the heat, watching Daniel tap 2 fingers against Ghost's collar before every patrol. Always twice. Never once. A promise. A habit. A goodbye he never knew was a goodbye. Ghost stood very still, rain running down the bridge of his nose. Then the man inside the van opened his eyes, and though they were clouded with exhaustion and confusion, they turned toward the white dog as if pulled by a light no darkness could bury. The man inside the van blinked slowly, adjusting to the dim, rain-filtered light that pooled across the gray bench seat. Isaiah Brooks lowered himself to one knee beside the vehicle, careful not to startle him, careful not to break the fragile rhythm that Ghost had created. The dog pressed a paw against the glass lightly, head tilting, ears forward, eyes locked with the living figure who had been absent from their lives for 18 months. Isaiah recognized the small, involuntary movements that indicated recognition was forming somewhere deep beneath layers of confusion and exhaustion. Emily Mercer stood behind him, her hand lightly gripping his sleeve, eyes wide, with hope and disbelief. The faint scent of damp cloth and hair reached them, a signal that had carried across oceans, deployments, and time. Isaiah spoke in a low, steady voice. You are safe now. You are not alone. Ghost shifted slightly, nose brushing the man's fingers through the glass, and the subtle touch, combined with the familiar scent of Daniel's clothing, caused a small reaction. His hand twitched, curling around the strap of the collar that had survived the months, the familiar metal tag catching the faint light. Isaiah carefully opened the rear doors, and the figure rose slowly, unsteady, each motion deliberate, cautious, like a man reacquainting himself with a world he once knew. Ghost stepped back, then forward again, circling once, sniffing, then leaning into him as if confirming every detail. The man's eyes, clouded at first, began to focus, amber flecked with recognition, the same color as Ghost's eyes had seen in every shared patrol, every quiet night when one relied on the other to keep watch. Isaiah extended a hand slowly, giving space for the reunion to unfold naturally, and the man, still weak but aware, placed his fingers atop Isaiah's palm, a brief anchor, a reassurance that he existed and could feel the connection without words. Outside, the rain eased into a gentle drizzle, each drop falling softly on the asphalt, carrying away some of the tension that had built with each step, each breath, each uncertain glance. Emily exhaled a breath she had been holding, the corners of her eyes wet but luminous with tears that were no longer only grief. Ghost circled back, nose to the man's chest rising and falling, steadying him in the way that only a K9 could, guiding a soul back from absence. Isaiah's gaze swept the parking lot, noting the small details, the red mud tracing a path from the chapel steps to the van, the faint smell of lilies mixing with wet earth, the rhythm of breath between dog and man. He thought of the desert and the schoolyard, of the blue strips of cloth tied around children's wrists, of the quiet moments when loyalty was not tested by conflict, but by patience, by faith, by the simple insistence of a dog who refused to believe someone was gone. The man stepped fully out of the van, guided gently by Isaiah's hand and Ghost's nose pressing against his leg, and for the first time in 18 months, he felt solid ground beneath his own boots. His eyes met Emily's, widening, and a faint tremor crossed his lips as a whisper escaped. "Mom?" The sound was hoarse, fragile, but it carried all the weight of presence, of proof, of return. Emily stepped forward, arms outstretched, and the man took tentative steps toward her, guided by Isaiah's steady hands, by Ghost's subtle nudges, by the familiarity that needed no explanation. The drizzle turned lighter still, catching on Ghost's wet fur, casting a sheen across his white coat, illuminating each strand as though a halo of devotion had descended. Isaiah watched, every muscle tense yet relaxed, knowing the moment was delicate, sacred, real. The man reached Emily, hands on her shoulders, and they held each other for the first time in what felt like years, Ghost lying down beside them, chest pressed to the earth, ears alert, still, every hair receptive to the shift of emotion around him. Isaiah took a step back, letting the scene breathe, letting the world align itself around the reunion, the return of someone presumed lost. The air smelled of wet asphalt, lilies, and loyalty, and in that mingling, in the soft echo of distant bells from the chapel, Isaiah understood what Ghost had been trying to say all along. Absence does not erase the bond, and faith, once planted, never truly fades. Isaiah Brooks stepped back from the van just enough to give Ghost space, watching as the white German shepherd circled the man with careful precision, nose twitching at each faint scent carried on the drizzle-laden wind. The man, still fragile and confused, sat on the edge of the rear bench seat, shoulders hunched, eyes scanning the dog as though he could remember everything through him. Emily Mercer remained a few feet behind, hands folded in front of her, her breath catching in short, uneven pulse, the soft patter of rain on the asphalt filling the silence between heartbeats. Isaiah moved closer, crouching slightly, aware that this moment was balanced on the edge of trust, that even the slightest wrong movement could fracture it. Ghost barked once, low and deliberate, a sound that was neither panic nor joy, but an unmistakable summons. The man stirred, head tilting, amber eyes reflecting both uncertainty and the faintest recognition. Isaiah could see it in the way the fingers that had been clasped around the collar strap now flexed, exploring the texture, tracing familiar lines as if memory itself was waking in tiny, careful increments. Ghost stepped forward, lowering his head to touch the man's hand with his snout, the contact light but deliberate, and the man exhaled, a breath that carried relief, fear, and a hint of incredulity all at once. Emily let a small gasp escape, instinctively moving one hand forward, but Isaiah gently guided her back, knowing the bond between the dog and the Marine needed the first moments uninterrupted. The drizzle had slowed to a mist, each droplet catching the morning light, turning the pavement into a glossy sheet, and Isaiah noted the subtle sheen on Ghost's fur, the way the wet white coat clung to the lean muscles beneath, every detail highlighting the dog's alert, patient presence. The man's gaze followed the dog, lingering on the gentle movement, the wagging tail that was not frantic but measured, the way Ghost's ears flicked with subtle signals, and something shifted in him, an acknowledgement that what he was seeing was real and that the world, though changed, had not abandoned him entirely. Isaiah's mind wandered briefly back to deployments, to long patrols when Ghost had anticipated danger without hesitation, guiding them safely through unfamiliar streets, responding to threats that humans could not perceive. Now the same instincts were at work, not for survival in a combat zone, but for the return of something equally vital: connection, recognition, presence. The man slowly moved his hands down, brushing lightly over Ghost's head, and the dog responded with a soft huff of acceptance, leaning in to press his warmth against the man's side. Emily stepped forward cautiously, tears glimmering in the soft gray light, and Isaiah gave her a nod of reassurance, acknowledging that the moment was unfolding as it should, naturally, without intrusion. The van doors were open now, rain dripping from the edges, creating small puddles at their feet, and Isaiah noted the small details: the slight sway of the trees in the background, the damp smell of grass mixing with the scent of wet asphalt, and the faint trace of the dog's coat. Every element seemed to conspire to make this reunion precise, deliberate, perfect in its slow unfolding. The man attempted to stand, still unsteady, and Ghost stepped aside, circling to ensure that Isaiah could provide support if needed, that Emily could witness without disruption. Isaiah extended a steadying hand, which the man took, and the subtle pressure, the trust in that grasp, sent a wave through the Marine, a reminder of everything they had been through together: the silent oaths, the long watches, the quiet understanding of a partnership that transcended words. Ghost settled briefly, head down, chest rising and falling in rhythm with the man's tentative movements, allowing the connection to solidify, anchoring the man to the present while affirming the loyalty that had carried through months of absence. Isaiah felt the air shift around them, lighter, almost sacred, each droplet of rain a soft punctuation, each breath an acknowledgement that a bond once thought broken had endured. The man looked back at Emily, eyes wide with the first real spark of recognition, and she stepped closer, placing her hand on his arm. Ghost moved between them, steady and calm, ensuring that neither step was rushed, that each motion was measured, that the trust and love woven through 18 months of separation could unfold without disruption, a perfect choreography of patience, presence, and quiet joy. Isaiah watched, chest tight, as the man's gaze flicked from Ghost to Emily, and the first words escaped his lips, halting, cautious, carrying the weight of disbelief and hope. "Mom?" The sound hung in the misty air, carried lightly by the drizzle, and Ghost gave a soft whine of approval, pressing his body close, steadying both the man and the mother who had waited for too long, every heart in the small parking lot attuned to the gentle miracle that was quietly, perfectly, happening. The word reached Emily Mercer before it reached anyone else, and when it did, the strength went out of her knees so gently that Isaiah Brooks caught her by the elbow before she could fall. She did not collapse. Mothers like Emily did not collapse in moments like that. They simply forgot the weight of their own bodies for one breath, because the soul had run ahead of the flesh. The man on the edge of the van stared at her with wet eyes and a face carved thin by time, uncertainty, and long wandering. But beneath the beard, beneath the hollow cheeks, beneath the confusion that made his gaze move like a candle in a draft, there was Daniel Mercer. Older, quieter, changed in ways no report could measure, but alive. Emily lifted a shaking hand toward his face. "Danny," she whispered, and the name seemed to move through the parking lot like a hymn sung under the breath. Daniel flinched at first, not from fear of her, but from the sudden nearness of a memory too bright to hold. Ghost stepped between them just enough to press his shoulder against Daniel's leg, steadying him, telling him without words that this touch was safe, this voice was home, this woman had waited. Daniel looked down at the white dog, and his fingers moved again over the black leather collar strap in his hand. He swallowed hard. His lips parted. For a moment, nothing came out but breath. Then, very softly, he said, "Blue team." Isaiah closed his eyes. The rain, the chapel, the casket, the impossible van, all of it narrowed to those two words. Blue team. The words Daniel had spoken to frightened children in a courtyard 18 months ago. The words no stranger would know. Emily made a sound that broke clean through her restraint, and she reached for him. Daniel leaned forward, hesitated for half a heartbeat, then folded into his mother's arms with the clumsy uncertainty of a man learning the shape of his own life again. She held him as if he were both a child and a miracle, as if letting go might return him to whatever silence had hidden him from her. Ghost sat beside them, close enough that Daniel's knee touched his shoulder, and the dog's eyes remained fixed on his face, watchful and calm, as though still guarding a door only he could see. Isaiah turned when footsteps splashed across the wet pavement behind him. The young Marine had returned with the chaplain and two emergency medical technicians from a county ambulance that was just pulling into the lot, lights turning red against the rain-silvered cars. The technicians approached carefully, speaking in low voices, carrying blankets and a medical bag. Isaiah raised one hand, not to stop them, but to slow the world down. "Give him a second," he said. They understood. Some moments were medical. Some were holy first. Daniel's breathing trembled against Emily's shoulder. His eyes moved to Isaiah, searching. The recognition there was weaker than with Ghost, but it was present, flickering like a signal through fog. Isaiah stepped closer and removed his white glove. He did not know why he did it. Maybe because ceremony no longer fit. Maybe because flesh and truth mattered more now than dress protocol. He offered his bare hand, palm open, steady. Daniel looked at it for a long moment. Then his fingers reached out and gripped Isaiah's hand. The grip was weak, but the pattern of it was familiar, thumb tightening twice, the old silent field signal they had used when words were not needed. Isaiah's throat burned. "Mercer," he said, voice rough but controlled. Daniel blinked at the name. A tear slipped down through the rain on his cheek. Staff Sergeant. It was not fully certain. It was not clean, but it was enough to make every Marine standing near the chapel door go still. Isaiah nodded once. Yes. Daniel looked past him toward the chapel, toward the open rear door where warm lights spilled onto the wet steps. Inside, the funeral flowers still waited. The flag still waited. The empty chair still waited. His expression shifted, confused and troubled, as if some part of him understood the shape of what had almost happened. "I saw my name," he whispered. "On a paper. At the clinic. I thought." His voice faded. The emergency technician placed a blanket gently around his shoulders. Daniel accepted it without taking his eyes off Ghost. "I only remembered him," he said. "The white dog. The collar. Blue cloth. I kept trying to get here." Isaiah listened, and the missing months began to form in fragments. Not yet a full story, but enough to understand that Daniel had been found overseas after the mission, moved through field clinics and charity care under a mistaken identity, his memory broken into islands. He had been transferred back to the United States for treatment through civilian channels, a living man misplaced by paperwork, illness, language, and time. It was not malice that had hidden him. It was the quiet failure of systems too large to notice one wounded soul trying to remember his own name. Ghost had noticed. Ghost had kept the truth where men had lost it. Daniel lowered his hand toward the dog's head, and Ghost leaned into his palm with such tenderness that even the paramedic turned away to wipe his face. Daniel's mouth trembled. His eyes softened. Then, from somewhere deeper than memory, deeper than injury, deeper than all the months stolen from him, he gave the command that had once begun every safe return. "Heal, boy." Ghost rose instantly and moved to Daniel's left side. Perfect, proud, trembling only in the tail that swept once against the wet pavement. Isaiah let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh and almost like a sob. Emily pressed her forehead to her son's temple. The chaplain bowed his head. And behind them, inside St. Matthew's Chapel, the empty chair waited no longer as a symbol of absence, but as the first witness to a mercy no one had dared to ask for aloud. The rain had slowed to a whisper, droplets clinging to the branches of the nearby oaks, shimmering faintly as the early sunlight began to break through the clouds. Isaiah Brooks stood slightly to the side, his hand still resting lightly on Daniel Mercer's shoulder, feeling the warmth that came from recognition, presence, and trust. Ghost sat at Daniel's feet, white coat still damp, ears alert, eyes scanning the parking lot as if ensuring that nothing could intrude upon this moment of reunion. Emily Mercer remained pressed against her son, her hands clasping his arms, tears rolling slowly down her cheeks, but her breathing had evened, the tension releasing from her shoulders with each heartbeat. The van, the chapel, the empty chair, everything that had carried the weight of absence seemed to exhale, the elements bending around the small circle of family and friends who now understood that miracles often came quietly, in small increments, and were witnessed first by those who had faith enough to notice. Isaiah looked around at the other Marines, their expressions a mixture of awe, relief, and quiet pride, and he realized that the years, the missions, the hardships, and the separations were all threaded together into this single moment, where loyalty, patience, and instinct had culminated in presence, in life remembered and found. Ghost stretched, a soft yawn breaking the tension of his vigilant stance, and pressed his side again against Daniel's legs, offering comfort and grounding, the simple proof that one could endure time and distance, suffering and confusion, and still emerge whole with those who mattered most. Daniel finally spoke, voice low, steadying as if the words themselves carried the weight of months. "I remember now." Emily drew in a deep, trembling breath, placing a gentle kiss on her son's temple, and the small exhalation seemed to carry away months of worry, fear, and uncertainty. Isaiah stepped closer, lowering his gaze to meet Daniel's eyes, and nodded once, a subtle affirmation that the Marines, the dog, and the mother who had waited had all arrived at the same understanding. Absence does not erase love, silence does not dissolve faith, and even the smallest actions of loyalty can guide someone home. Ghost rested his head on Daniel's boot, chest rising and falling in quiet cadence, the tail sweeping slowly across the wet asphalt, grounding the reunion in the physical world, reminding all present that miracles often arrive through steadfast patience rather than grand gestures. The morning air carried the mingling scents of wet earth, lilies from the chapel, and the faint lingering smell of dog fur and human presence, weaving together the sensory proof that life persisted, that connections endured, and that hearts could be mended, even after the longest separation. Isaiah allowed himself a slow exhale, one hand brushing a wet strand of hair from Emily's face while his other remained lightly on Daniel's shoulder, and he realized that sometimes the proof of loyalty, the evidence of love and dedication, came in subtle ways. A bark at a chair, a touch on the hand, the slow recognition of a familiar scent, and that in those moments, the world could feel both impossibly small and infinitely vast. Daniel lifted his head, meeting Ghost's amber gaze directly, and for the first time in months, he smiled, faint but genuine, as understanding and memory threaded through him like sunlight piercing through storm clouds. Ghost responded with a gentle wag, chest rising, ears flicking, tail brushing the damp pavement once more, confirming that the circle was complete, the bond intact, the miracle quietly acknowledged. Isaiah stepped back slightly, letting mother, son, and dog hold the center of the space, feeling the warmth of the reunion expand outward, touching everyone present. The chapel bell tolled faintly in the distance, marking the hour with a soft resonance, and Isaiah, watching the sunlight glint across the wet surfaces, the gleam in Daniel's eyes, the steady breathing of Ghost at his side, felt a profound sense of grace settle over the scene. Months of uncertainty, absence, and worry had culminated in this quiet, sacred moment of homecoming, where love had endured, loyalty had guided, and the smallest acts, the bark, the paw, the patient wait, had made all the difference. In that soft light, surrounded by rain-kissed asphalt and the gentle rustle of leaves, Daniel's mother, her son, and the faithful white K9 shared a breath that was theirs alone, a moment of quiet triumph and deep human and canine connection, the kind of bond that no time, no distance, no misfortune could sever, leaving everyone present with the understanding that sometimes grace arrives not in spectacle, but in steadfast presence, in recognition, and in the enduring love of those who refuse to let go.